Okay, so as you may know, the first attempt at recording this for some reason didn't contain the soundtrack, the audio track, so I'm just re-recording this now. Right, so when considering luminance images, so this is an image which only contains intensity information. So excuse me, you can represent this as a grayscale image. It's sort of a function of intensity over space. Then we need some kind of standard notation to represent that concept. And the obvious way of thinking about this is to consider the luminance or grayscale image to be a function of two variables, x and y. And those two variables, and this is kind of conventionally the conventional norm, each of these two variables represents a real valued variable. So we write that by saying x and y, so the tuple x and y, the two coordinates x and y, represent a space on the two-dimensional plane, which is composed of the real axis, or the axis of real numbers, and in particular an outer product between the axis of real numbers. So what that means is that if you got something like this x used between two sets, what you are talking about is the combination of the two possible. Sorry, let me just get rid of this stupid thing from here. Oh, great, I can't get rid of it. Okay, so we're thinking of the space of let's say real valued numbers this way, and I think that's still just about okay. So let's redraw this. So we're thinking about a two-dimensional axis in which we have y along one axis and we have x along the other axis, like this. So that's the values x. Unfortunately, I don't have my my tablet with me, so this is going to be a little bit messy. And the origin is of course over here. Okay, so that's the origin of two-dimensional space. So when you see that notation, you should immediately think of this kind of thing. So a two-dimensional plane where you've got real valued coordinates along x and y. And if we wanted to extend this to 3 dimensions, of course, we would put an extra times r there, right, which would give us a third axis. So this, however, is really treated as a mapping. So what that means is that given particular coordinates of locations in this two-dimensional space, given by a pair xy, f, the image, simply represents a map from that spatial location to an intensity. Now, in this case, if we think about typical grayscale images or typical luminance images, we don't have negative luminance. So we don't allow negative values of intensity, generally speaking, for an image. Now, there are some tricks that we'll see later on which allow us to represent negative values in a sort of a constructed image. But natural images in the real world will always represent maybe it's luminance, maybe it's even a triplet of red, green, blue values, and those values will, by convention, only represent 0 or positive real values, or will only represent 0 positive real values. So we express that by saying that that intensity that f maps r squared onto consists of the set of 0, so 0 intensity, usually black and no illumination. Physically, no photons arriving at that location in space or being emitted by that location in space. And also taking positive real valued numbers. So we say that f is a map from r squared onto the set 0 and positive real numbers, or the set or the mapping onto the set of numbers comprising of positive real valued numbers and 0. You can also say non-negative real valued numbers, and that would also include 0 and r+. Color images, on the other hand, can be considered as either a collection of three different maps. So one for red intensity, for if we were using an RGB color space, you'd have a map for red intensity, a map for green intensity, or a map for blue intensity. So three separate maps. Or what you can also have is treat a color image of continuous space as a mapping from R by R, just as you do for grayscale images, but onto a vector. And that vector, if the color space consists of a three-dimensional color cube, then you would map onto real valued numbers in the interval 0 to 1 for the red axis, 0 to 1 for the green axis, and 0 to 1 for the blue axis. Okay, so that would be for a color image as a function of continuous space. Now, apart from the obvious intensity distribution that we find in a luminance image, which we'll come to different ways of characterizing the structure we see in images. But one of the things we sometimes want to do is to find simple models to describe spatial structure. So when we talk about spatial structure, we can either talk about global spatial structure, so some kind of spatial structure that's over a broad part of the image, over a large scale, or we might talk about image structure that is visible over a small scale. So for the small scale ones, we often consider local features such as lines, edges, and points. Indeed, edges can actually can span the whole image, as can lines, but these are I would say these things are fairly rare. I mean, if you look, sort of global spanning lines and edges are relatively rare in a typical image. You might have an image of natural scenes where you have the horizon or you have roads running off into the distance, and so those are examples of where you have lines that and perhaps edges that span the scale of the image. But actually, a lot of what we interpret about everyday objects consists of quite local image features, and so these are fairly important. So by the term local, it's kind of it's a slightly fuzzy thing to define, because you can have different scales of locality, so the term local usually refers to some region that's of limited extent, but that limited extent is considered to be limited relative to the size of the image. You can also use the term image patch to describe, or image neighborhood to describe, a relatively small region of an image. Now, there's also this idea of some kind of structure that takes place over a larger scale, and this is sometimes referred to as non-local structure. So non-local structure becomes apparent, is sort of a very strong visual cue, because we are kind of primed to look for continuity in structures or lines or edges that might be interrupted by occlusion within our field of view. So it turns out that coherent and unbroken shapes are quite easily perceived by human vision, and this is something that happens in quite it's quite a global way. So if we have a look at this figure here, 27, which is quite a disturbing figure, I still haven't quite formed a conclusion as to what this thing represents, but a lot of our perception of the spatial structure of this thing that we see here, which by the way also kind of induces motion if you sort of move your eye around relative to this image. But there's a kind of a global structure that's actually induced by the patterns of black and white stripes that sort of a little bit snake-like and spiral around this shape. So looking at this very carefully, if I trace my way around here, I basically find that this seems to be an outer circle, and this also seems to be, this here also is also a circle, but the two things kind of seem connected, despite the fact that they're not. So there's sort of a spiral thing that gets induced because your visual system is desperately trying to make sense of this, and it's interpreting some of these things as being the local structure as contributing to a global structure. You can also look at this thing here, which shows, you can see so this is a nice illustration of the difference between local and global structure, quite apart from the weird kind of movement hallucination that gets induced here. But you've got the global structure being the 4 broad circles, and that's composed of some small local circles. So that would be an example of local structure, and then the 4 organizations of these 4 circular groups of circles would be described as global structure. So the other thing that becomes that's an important piece of terminology that is used is the notion of texture, and it usually the term is used to refer to a number of spatial attributes, including things like the appearance of materials, things like the coarseness of spatial structure, the fineness of spatial structure, or perhaps the regularity of spatial structure, such as in mostly in man-made structures like a brick wall, or perhaps a carpet or something like that, or some sort of fabric for a shirt or a dress. But to appreciate the meaning of the term texture, one of the things that I think is really nice is to look at something called the Brodat's textures, which provides an indication of what we mean when we describe different textural structures, and it's quite remarkable what this looks like. So let me just see if I can grab my. There you go. So here is an example of. This is the Brodat's. So this is just typing Brodat's textures into Google. So what you see is there's a few example images. Oh, by the way, I've typed Brodat's texture, but also clicked selected images, and so you can see here's examples of regular patterns. There's one here as well. There's a brick wall, but you've got some natural occurring patterns, some woven patterns, some things that could be like bits of tarmac, bits of concrete, etc. So. And here you've got the idea of some patterns that are quite irregular down here, right? So textural patterns are a quite important property in doing things like computer graphics for video games, rendering scenes for movies, and using CGI and things like that. So there's the Brodat's texture algorithm is used it presents a large sample of different types of textures, and this is used to assess algorithms which are being designed primarily to distinguish spatial regions based on texture. So for example, if you're looking at the microscopy of slices through the brain, for example, there are different brain regions that, because they have slightly different wiring and cell shape and organization, they will visually have a different texture appearance. Also, if you look at something like an MR scan, then different regions of tissue, even if they have similar intensities, might have different degrees of texture. So texture itself is something that we aspire to often to measure, but also to generate for use in various applications in gaming and so on. Okay, that was to illustrate the notion of texture. Okay, so through many years of research into human psychophysics and the processing of digital images, and also just experiments in visual psychophysics that have been conducted to measure things like acuity, degrees of perception, subtlety of perception. In some cases, these tests are used to look at problems within human vision. So patients will sometimes be involved in these sorts of studies. But what we know is that the visual system of humans actually, it does processing at different scales, different sizes of structures. It means that you have both local processing going on and the ability to detect structure at fine scales, but also the ability to detect structure at coarse, large spatial scales. So it also turns out there's another very important property. So apart from texture, the notion of assessing the scale, so how big or how small something is not necessarily its physical size, but its size within our field of view, is quite an important visual cue. And so there are tools, I would say, within the visual system that can assess this reasonably well, with assessment getting poorer as the size of whatever structure it is gets larger in our field of view. So our sense of precision in estimating size and scale gets worse as the objects get bigger, which is perhaps not surprising. But the other thing that's a very important property is orientation. So if I were to sketch some sort of, here's an image plane which is bounded in size. And then within this image plane, I've got a region that where on this side, let's say, the image is dark. And on this side, the image is light. So this is dark. That's dark. And on this side, the image is, let's say, is lighter. Okay, so here it's bright. Let's put bright rather than dark. Bright. Sorry about the painful writing here, because I'm redoing the lectures because of the failed audio for whatever reason. So this is just doing this with my trackpad. Okay, so here you've got a very clear edge between dark and light. So your visual system is very, very highly attuned to both detect this boundary and also make estimates of its orientation. So what I mean by that is if I have another image and I have a tilt in that boundary between light and dark, so this is dark on this side and this is light on this side, then I can estimate, make an estimate of that orientation reasonably accurately. And we will look at ways of assessing the orientation, so whether something is completely vertical, whether it's sort of at an angle, whether it's horizontal. Basically, in plane rotation, we can make really good estimates of that. And in fact, in describing the shapes of structures, what we are doing is locally estimating orientation and making quite accurate assessments of orientation as a function of position around boundary. So we'll look at techniques for doing this in chapter 3 and 4.